Welcome to A Journey Through Alresford. This programme has been produced in an attempt to not only visually chronicle the history of the village, but to also document its characteristics in the years 1997 and 98, so future generations can look back on the film and reminisce about their community. One of the greatest assets the people of Alresford feel their home has is its location. The village lies on the banks of the River Colne, nestled in a quiet corner of rural Essex. This affords its residents some of the most beautiful scenery in the area, with woodland walks, wide sweeping open fields, and of course the river and the creek itself. However, combined with this, Alresford is only a 30-minute drive from the coastal resort of Clacton-on-Sea, even less to the town of Colchester, and within an hour and a half of London itself. Whilst all these points are indeed an advantage, perhaps the most important one to the people of the village is that Alresford is home. Ultimately, home is where the heart is, and for the vast majority of the residents of this peaceful Essex village, their heart is right here. Welcome to Alresford. Over the course of the programme, we will take you on a journey through the village, on 3 walks that can actually be undertaken, delving into the past and exploring some of Alresford's more historical points of interest, before coming into the residential centre of the village, where the community life of today is more prominent. Over the years, people of local, national and even international importance have played a part in shaping the rich heritage of this village, and we will explore their relevance at various points of the programme. So sit back, relax and join with us as we embark upon a journey through Alresford. The first of our 3 walks through Alresford begins at a point that most people would consider is not actually situated in the village. This is the Tide Mill at Thorrington, located just off of Brightlingsea Road. Although today only one building is visible, in previous years a windmill was also located on this site. In December of 1869, however, a severe gale caused great damage to the windmill, as indeed it did to much of the surrounding area, and from this point on it was no longer operational. The Tide Mill, which was originally built to grind and supply flour, was also affected badly and fell into a state of disrepair, and although various owners restored the building on a number of occasions, it was not until 1941, when a Mr. Glover bought the mill, that the building was fully renovated. It was then used as a place to dry and store the seeds from flowers grown on the estate where it is situated. Today the mill, which dates back to 1558, is owned by Essex County Council, but is maintained by Mr. Glover's son, who is also the warden of the grounds. Although now a peaceful waterway, rarely frequented by any form of rivercraft, this narrow inlet was at one time the primary channel of moving goods along this stretch of the creek. As this beautiful view of the river shows, seen from the top of nearby All Saints Church, the river snakes along to Alresford Creek, a popular walk for many, particularly during the summer months. The pathway meanders along the banks of the river for approximately 1 mile before it eventually arrives at the creek itself, and this is where most villagers believe that Alresford begins. Before you join the main Ford Lane which leads up into the village, you see a beautiful house on the right-hand side, known as Ford Cottages. Since its recent restoration, the cottages have now been converted to a single property, but in its original state it was in fact 2 addresses. Ford Cottages were built around the 1650s and are therefore rightly regarded as one of Alresford's oldest residences. In the 1930s, a man named Jack Humphrey was employed to restore the cottages, and whilst removing plasterwork, he discovered some beautifully carved wooden panels. After making further inquiries, they were found to be very valuable, but today the whereabouts of the panels is a mystery. From 1945 to 1979, the Potter family occupied the cottage nearest the sea, and during this time, the workers from the barges moored at the nearby jetty would visit the family, and the two would exchange goods. In 1953, however, when Essex as a whole suffered great floods, the cottagers did not escape. Mr. and Mrs. Potter returned home to be met by the river already covering the road at the bottom of Ford Lane, even though high tide was still some 3 hours away. Thankfully, nobody was injured, but serious damage was done to the properties. After the Potters left in 1979, the cottage was empty for a few years, and in this time it became totally dilapidated. The next owners took on a massive undertaking, and to their credit they restored the building greatly. But it was not until the present incumbents took up residence that the beauty of the building was fully restored. In the shadow of All Saints' Church, Brightlingsea, the cottage has a rightful place in the history and heritage of the village of Alresford. It affords its owners beautiful views over probably the most famous and photographed site in Alresford, that of the creek itself and the now dilapidated jetty. In days gone by, the creek used to be a busy place, as the barges that collected flour from the tide mill would sail through. They would, however, have to be towed back to Alresford, as the width of the river by the mill was too narrow to allow them to turn around. Other boats would be busy loading and unloading such materials as slates and lime in exchange for other goods, such as bales of straw, which would be taken to London to be used in the city stables. It is almost possible to picture the scene, the various sea craft making their way up the river, the swing bridge opening for the boats to go through, and every so often a train crossing back and forth to Brightlingsea. Whilst today the serenity of Alresford Creek is immediately apparent, in times past it enjoyed a prominent place in the industry that flowed through the village. Before we turn and walk up Ford Lane towards the village centre, it's worthwhile continuing along the creek footpath to where the old railway bridge that once served the town of Brightlingsea was situated. The line which ran between Colchester Hythe and Wivenhoe opened in 1863. However, plans published in the Essex Standard 2 years previous showed a proposed route that incorporated the town of Brightlingsea, but due to its location, a bridge would need to be constructed that spanned Alresford Creek. The plans were subsequently approved, and the Wivenhoe to Brightlingsea line opened on the 18th of April 1866. The swing bridge was 430 feet long and was supported by a number of concrete pillars, which today are the only visible evidence of its existence. The centre of the bridge was opened manually by inserting a T-bar into a cog, which would then open the central segment some 90 degrees. Once opened, this part of the bridge would rest on 2 wooden piers. It would open for 2 hours either side of high tide, to let barges and ships visiting the tide mill and the sand and ballast works pass through, but would obviously close if a train was expected. The line regularly suffered a fair amount of flood damage, and it was common for trains to be delayed or cancelled. During the severe floods at the beginning of the 20th century, around half of all the ballast and track were washed away, and the line was threatened with closure, but quick and efficient repairs enabled the service to continue. However, the major flood of 1953 did cause the line to temporarily close. The effects of this flood were devastating. Sheep and cattle were killed, many homes destroyed, and over 100 lives were lost to the sea along the east coast. But again, after major repair work, the line reopened in December of the same year. 11 years later, however, on the 14th of June 1964, the line to Brightlingsea officially closed. With only 600 passengers travelling each day, the service was no longer financially viable, and in November of the same year, the line which served Brightlingea's community was finally lifted. As you walk back towards the jetty, you will see a large house which is known as Alresford Lodge. It is now privately owned, and there is no public access to the property, But the lodge, which can be traced back as far as 1730, also has an interesting history. A Mr. Henry Barton cultivated what was then called Lodge Farm. He was the parish surveyor and general overseer, and was considered an upstanding and respected citizen within Alresford. Over the years, the property changed hands a number of times, and eventually came to be owned by the Pilkington family, people who have played an important part in the history of the village over the last 80 years or so. The family moved to Alresford from the north of England in the early 1920s after the First World War. A wealthy and industrious family, they owned High Elms, now known as Tenpenny Farm, and Brickhouse Farm, now situated in St Andrew's Close, as well as Alresford Lodge. They also owned the garage on the main Colchester Road, and vehicles from there were often used in transporting farm produce to the London markets. The lodge itself, however, was used by the British military forces in both World Wars. During the First, Australian soldiers were billeted here, whilst during the 1939-45 conflict, it is known that a searchlight was positioned in the grounds. The officer in charge was made very welcome by the Pilkingtons, and he described the family as being a happy and very hospitable one. Alresford Lodge also housed a number of Italian prisoners of war who, during their stay, worked as general labourers. In 1965, the lodge was sold on to Sir Miles Wyatt from Alresford Hall, and has changed hands a number of times since then. It is a stunning construction that gives its occupants glorious views out over the creek, and upon entering via the water itself, the lodge is one of the first prominent landmarks that comes into view, and rightly takes its place amongst the most noble properties within the village. Our walk then turns around and makes its way up Ford Lane, where on the left-hand side you can see Alresford Sand and Ballast Works. The Alresford Sand and Ballast Company was formed in 1932 by three brothers from the Barrell family, who were joined by Mr. Jack Orrock when he married their sister Madeline. When Mr. Orrock died in 1991, his son Peter took over the management and ownership of the company, and it remains one of the few privately owned aggregate works in the area. Being so close to the river, the company erected a jetty in the creek which allowed for the loading of sand and ballast onto barges, which in turn would supply London and Kent. The wood for this construction was obtained from surplus materials used in the building of nearby Clacton Pier, but in time, due to the rising mud levels in the creek, only smaller barges could access the jetty. This eventually became uneconomical, and in August 1969 the last barge collected materials and the jetty closed. The Sand and Ballast Company is one of the largest industries in Alresford, and altogether has 4 sites, the others being in Wivenhoe, Brightlingsea and Great Bentley. In Alresford alone, approximately 76,000 tonnes are excavated each year, supplying mainly civil engineering and building contractors for the construction of schools, houses and roads. The company also supplied aggregates used in the building of both Mildenhall and Lakenheath airfields. They were the first in the area to introduce ready-mixed concrete, and after a lot of scepticism, it proved to be very successful. Whilst being an excavation works, they do their utmost not to spoil the surrounding countryside, and have won conservation awards for their work. As you exit the Sand and Ballast Works and head towards the village centre, an almost immediate left turn introduces another public footpath. This takes you along the top of the 2 large gravel pits, which are now leased for the use of pleasure fishing, the second of which is home to the Alresford Angling Association. In 1968, Don Munson approached the Sand and Ballast Company with a proposal to fish one of their pits at Church Meadows. A meeting was called at the Pointer, and so began what is known as the AAA. In the first year, the membership consisted of 60 people, a number which has since grown to nearly 200, with more on a waiting list. When the club first formed, the season consisted of only friendly matches, but from 1971, serious competitions were fished, allowing winners to obtain cups and shields. The club has 8 team matches per year and fishes against other organisations, including the police, the army and the Watersiders, In the present day, club members may fish 5 lakes in all, at both Alresford and Freighting. All house a variety of fish, including bream, tench, rudd and carp. Carrying along the footpath, on the left-hand side you will eventually come to a small cottage. This private road is the access route to the splendid Alresford Grange. The Grange overlooks the estuary of the River Colne and allows stunning views over the water, stretching across to Mersey Island and the surrounding parklands. Although at first glance it appears much older, this very attractive house was built just before the First World War, in the style of a Tudor mansion, incorporating many timber beams which run throughout the house itself. It is truly a lavish property, and every room in the building is exquisitely furnished. The house has recently been occupied by the Blair family, and the gardens are currently undergoing extensive restorations. Part of the garden is secluded by a large wall, where a wrought iron gate opens to a pathway leading down to the creek itself. Currently the house is situated in 26 acres of land and is surrounded by stables, outbuildings, an indoor squash court and what used to be the servants' quarters. The house was built for Wilson Marriage, the local mill owner and 4 times Mayor of Colchester. He is pictured here with the Alresford Silver Band, whom he regularly invited to perform in the village. He lived here for some 20 years, dying in his 90s, and from that time the property has changed hands relatively few times. In the 1930s, Sir Arthur Wilmot bought the house and expanded it, adding the squash court, conservatory and some of the outbuildings, and it was also requisitioned by the army for military use during the Second World War. In 1944, the house was resold in the hope of it becoming a rest home for retired actresses. However, the enterprise did not last long, and a few years after this, the 2 Impey sisters purchased it. They were the granddaughters of Wilson Marriage, and were very pleased to have the house back in the family again. Alresford Grange is a property fit for aristocracy, a residence of true beauty that adds much to the landscape and heritage of the village. As we exit the Grange, you pass a small house on the left formerly occupied by Mr. Farthing, who lived there for many years, running errands and doing odd jobs for Wilson Marriage himself when he was a child. The last point of interest on our first walk is Marsh Farm, also located just off the footpath route. While still today a going concern, the property was originally farmed by Mr. Ben Wade, another prominent figure in Alresford's past, a man who played a large part in the life of the village. In 1921, a casket containing human bones was found when foundations of a cottage near Marsh Farm were being dug up. These have been dated back to between 650 and 900 years BC and can be found exhibited in Colchester Museum. At the end of the footpath, and indeed our first walk, one can see beautifully over the large field that was originally excavated by the Sand and Ballast Company, and opposite this, splendid views of the River Colne, with the neighbouring village of Wivenhoe clearly in sight. On most days, the field is grazing land to a number of horses that are stabled at Marsh Farm, and it allows them a wonderful expanse in which to spend their days. Visitors, however, are always welcomed profusely. The route you have walked will bring you to the very top of Wivenhoe Road itself, where you can walk along the footpath that flanks the road back into the village centre. Before we embark on the second of our walks, we will take a brief look at what is, for many of Alresford's residents, their main source of local information and the voice of the village, the Alresford Advertiser. At the time of writing, the free paper that is produced for the people of Alresford is about to print its 189th edition, with the 200th due to be published during the millennium year. The Advertiser started, however, some 28 years ago in May of 1970. At that time, and for the next 3 years, it was sponsored by the church, under the guidance of the then rector, Andrew Halliday Smith. It relied largely on donations to cover the production costs, with the church making up any shortfall that occurred. And whilst it was initially intended to be a monthly publication, it became more infrequent due to lack of funds. The current editor, Dave Clark, began working on the Advertiser in 1985, assisting Brian Briggs, who had been involved for many years. However, after Brian's death in 1987, Mr. Clark took over on a more permanent basis and has been doing it ever since. Nowadays it is produced on a Macintosh computer, a far cry from the years gone by when each article was laid out and pasted up by hand. 900 copies are printed each run, enough for every home in Alresford, with the remainder being sold from the post office. A team of 4 people run the magazine, with an additional 27 distributing the paper throughout the village. Although it doesn't make a vast profit, the Alresford Advertiser is sustained through the advertising revenue it receives, and any additional profit is given to local good causes. Although a number of people have assisted the production team over the years, more are always needed, and ultimately, if the information and articles are not forthcoming, the magazine, which is the voice of the village, will have no content and therefore will cease to exist. So, if you feel that you have something to offer, however small, then Dave Clark and his team would love to hear from you. Our second walk begins on the opposite side of the village, outside the Rose and Crown. Built in the early 1930s, the building we now see was previously the site of an old timber inn, which looked very different to the present-day construction. For many years this was the second of Alresford's public houses, but today stands as a bed and breakfast establishment. Opposite the Rose and Crown is Alresford Garage, another of the village's long-running enterprises. Almost directly adjacent to these 2 well-known village landmarks, you will see the entrance to Bluegates Farm. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was one of Alresford's major agricultural farms, and was for many years a popular pick-your-own location. As you leave Bluegates, cross over to the other side of the road and take the path which leads down Cockane's Lane. You will eventually encounter the entrance to the operational headquarters of Grinstead's apple orchards. Orchards have always played a large part in the history of Alresford, and like the Sand and Ballast Company, Grinstead's are the other main source of employment within the village. Cockane's farm, which is now owned by the Grinstead family, can be traced as far back as the Domesday Book of 1086, in which it is one of 2 large estates in Alresford to be mentioned. In a survey commissioned in 1730 by the then owner of Alresford Hall, Matthew Martin, Cockane's farm was documented as having some 84 acres of land. In the present day, only 55 are still farmed, but Grinsteads have some of the most modern equipment available to sort and segregate the 4 million apples which are grown within their orchards each year. As well as the orchards situated in Cockane's Lane, Grinsteads also own another at the opposite end of the village. This popular family-run business employs as many as 70 people at the height of the season, some of whom have worked at the orchard longer than the Grinstead family. The company also annually produces 10,000 bottles of its own brand of apple juice, which can be found in most of the village stores, and Grinstead supply many of the large supermarket chains, including Sainsbury's, Asda and Summerfield. Throughout the picking season, a total of 500 tonnes of apples are harvested from both orchards, together with a further 1,000 tonnes that are brought from other nearby orchards for packing. The highly modern, state-of-the-art computerised machinery sorts each apple into grade and size by weighing and photographing each one. Apples have always played a large part in the heritage of Alresford, and as the 21st century arrives, Grinsteads are upholding a tradition that continues to thrive. At the end of Cockane's Lane, the track joins Station Road itself, and this is where Alresford's main housing estate first comes into view. At the end of Station Road, however, is a small row of shops dominated by Lowe's supermarket. Although this is officially the name of the shop, many people in the village will always know the establishment as either Norrington's, after the family who ran the business for many years, or as it was previously known as the Corner Cafe, which was owned by the Dailies. The population of Alresford has risen sharply in the past 65 years or so, from being just 312 in 1931 to its present-day figure of almost 2,500. The majority of this influx of people arrived in the 1950s and 1960s, most of whom moved to the rural suburbs of Essex from London. The housing estate, situated in the centre of the village, began construction in 1961 and was built on agricultural land previously used for farming, and many of the roads are testimony to Alresford's rich heritage of apple growing. Despite this substantial growth, Alresford remains a close-knit and friendly community, and the serenity of a country village has not entirely evaporated, in some way due to the fact that it is still largely surrounded by fields and farmland. Alresford's main shopping centre is located in Station Road and is home to many of the village's most frequented outlets. Over the years, many businesses have traded from here, including restaurants, video rental shops, hardware stores, the list goes on, and whilst for many of them the population of Alresford has not been sufficient to sustain economic viability, there are a number who without doubt are part of the village landscape. Swinburne's Butchers, for example, have been trading from their spot in Station Road for more than 20 years, whilst the post office, managed by Ruth and Adrian Street, is without doubt the most frequented outlet in Alresford, and 4 postmen and women serve the 865 houses and approximately 60 businesses in the village. Adrian and Ruth came to Alresford from Canvey Island in February 1984, where previously they were both working in Barclays Bank. At this time they worked from the shop located next to the food store, but the Streets moved in March of 1996 to their current premises, which are considerably larger, with more facilities for the sorting of mail. As we reach the end of the 20th century, the population of Alresford stands at just over 2,300, and the post office is responsible for the distribution of mail to the residents of the village, whilst also being a newsagents and general stationers. Directly adjacent to the shopping centre is the railway station itself. In January of 1866, the Wivenhoe to Wheatley line opened, with intermediate stations at Alresford, Thorrington and Bentley Green as it was known then. The line which led to Walton opened the following year, and it is between here and Colchester that Alresford station now finds itself. The entire Tendring Hundred system was initially single track, and services consisted of 3 or 4 daily trains, with a Sunday service in the summer months only. The railway soon became a common mode of transport, and as more passengers used the service, an additional track was installed in 1898. It is now an everyday mode of transport for many, providing easy accessibility to nearby towns and cities, being only 57 miles from London and 5 miles from the town of Colchester. As you continue walking along Station Road, you will eventually come to the crossroads, whereupon, on your right-hand side, you will see the Pointer Public House, where you may wish to pause for refreshment. The Pointer was originally built as 2 separate cottages and can be seen on a local tithe map as far back as 1770, although there is reference to a disorderly alehouse at Alresford in the quarter section records of 1618. We will never know whether or not this refers to the Pointer. Maybe each individual should be left to decide for themselves. The pub was previously called the Chequers and was originally a coaching inn. This is, of course, today the name of the small cul-de-sac located behind the Pointer, and in the middle of the 16th century, berries from the checker bush were apparently used to flavour beer. The pub conceals a well in the western end of the building, which was used daily for domestic use until 1948, but is now boarded over under the floor of the restaurant area. In 1998, the Pointer is Alresford's only remaining public house, and is a central meeting point for many of the village community. It prides itself on being a quaint and traditional style pub, and is well worth a visit at any time. Also at the crossroads is the monument which was erected to celebrate the Silver Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II in 1977. Crossing directly over Wivenhoe Road, one enters Church Road, named after St Peter's, which can be found further towards the creek. Although Church Road actually ends at the junction of Ford Lane, and it is here that the school buildings of yesterday and today can be found. The old school was built in approximately 1864 to accommodate the slowly growing population of the village. However, on April the 22nd, 1884, a freak earthquake struck Alresford and the school was affected quite badly. History recounts a local man named Albert Carter, a pupil at the school at the time, commenting on the event.
The Alresford Village School in Ford Lane suffered a great deal. Its main chimney was brought down. No one was hurt, although bricks came hurtling through the skylight into the classroom, which was very frightening at the time. It was about 9:30 a.m. when the Reverend Bart was giving the children a scripture lesson. I can see him now with his hands uplifted saying, "Lord, save the children," while we all quickly rushed out of the open door.
Although a terrible ordeal at the time, the children were to be rewarded with 2 weeks' holiday from school lessons, whilst the chimney was rebuilt. The old school is now a privately owned residential property. Alresford County Primary School, situated directly opposite, was built in 1965 to accommodate the educational needs of the village's expanding population. The school was built to have 10 classes, being capable of holding up to 300 children, which it did in the 1970s. In the present day, however, there are 6 classes in total, accommodating 160 pupils. The current headmaster, Bob Newman, has served for 7 years at the school, and his vision for the future is its continued success. A number of teachers have worked at Alresford Primary for in excess of 20 years, further proving its popularity, not only with the pupils and parents, but also with the staff themselves. The school competes in a number of sports activities, both internally and against other schools within the district, recently winning trophies for both rugby and athletics. Alresford County Primary is very much a community-based school where parents are involved in classroom activities. The children are also encouraged to learn about the place in which they live, incorporating local businesses and industries within Alresford. There is an active Parent-Teachers Association which provides both financial and general support. An example of the PTA's work can be seen in the school grounds, where they donated a climbing activity centre as part of its 30th birthday celebrations. At present, the school are hoping to mark the millennium with something special, and there are plans to create an outdoor seating and picnic area to make break times more fun for the children. The small village school has always played a large part in many of the activities that take place within Alresford, and has served a number of generations of village children. As we go into the 21st century, its role continues, nurturing those children who are ultimately the future of Alresford. On the opposite side of Ford Lane is Church Farm. Whilst today, like a number of Alresford's farms, it is no longer a working establishment, it was in years gone by one of 12 major farms located in the village, specialising in cattle farming. The Gilmores, who managed the farm in the early 20th century, recommended Alresford to the aforementioned Pilkington family, and were largely responsible for their migration to the village. Continuing 100 yards or so down Ford Lane towards the river, you will notice a large house on the left-hand side. This is the old rectory. The house was built, or more accurately rebuilt, in 1838, but had served Alresford's clergy since the early 1300s. From 1332, there is an unbroken list of rectors, of which the present incumbent, the Reverend George Cobb, is the 53rd to take office in the village. Over the years, Alresford has had many faithful clergy, all attempting to spread the gospel amongst the local community. Today, the old rectory is privately owned, but remains an integral part of the village history. In the grounds of the house, you will see what was affectionately known as the Cabin, Alresford's first village hall. This was erected during the residence of the Reverend Pritchard, who lived there from 1907 to 1918. He was a prominent figure in the village, instilling much-needed enthusiasm and encouragement to the local people at a time when, due to the First World War, these things were understandably lacking. Indeed, the Reverend himself lost 3 sons to the conflict. The hall was used for many of the village's social gatherings, in much the same way as the present-day building. However, after the substantially larger new hall was constructed, this wooden building became largely obsolete, only then being used mainly as a meeting place for the various scout groups of the village. As one continues along Ford Lane, the War Memorial, which commemorates the Alresford men who gave their lives in the World Wars, becomes clearly visible. On Remembrance Sunday each year, a number of wreaths are laid in commemoration. Behind the memorial stands the shell of what is probably Alresford's most famous landmark, St Peter's Church. Built in 1320, this medieval building is thought to be of Saxon origin. It was built by Sir Orfrey de Staunton, the then lord of the manor. He died in 1380 and was laid to rest in this very churchyard. Upon wandering round the grounds, the graves of many prominent local people can be found, including the aforementioned Reverend Pritchard. However, probably the most talked about grave is that of a certain Robert Bray, whose stone bears the symbol of a pair of crossed bones. Generations of village children have long thought this to be the final resting place of a notorious pirate, when in reality it is, we are reliably informed, the grave of a man who lost his life to the plague. The village church is, in all communities, one of its primary focal points, and in Alresford, St Peter's was no exception. Sadly, however, this beautiful 14th century church was destroyed in October 1971 as fire raged through the building. The day before the celebration of harvest, most of the contents were lost. However, the large prayer book was saved, as was the Bible, some church registers, a silver communion chalice, the altar cross and some vases. This also is the original church key that opened the main door. Many priceless articles were destroyed, however, including ancient crests of the Alresford Hall families, all choir and clergy robes, as well as a large number of new kneelers and hymn books. The exact reason for the fire remains unknown to this day. Many people have different ideas and opinions as to what truly happened. However, the Colchester Express reported that the fire was started deliberately and confirmed that Clacton CID were treating the matter as arson. The then rector, Reverend Andrew Halliday Smith, kept the spirits of the people high, and on the day after the fire he christened 2 babies due to have been baptised at St Peter's. He even joked during the service, held at the village hall, that although his robes were holy, they were not unfortunately fireproof. In a statement taken shortly after, he expressed his deep sadness at the loss of the building, but declared that church life in Alresford must continue, as it has in the form of the affectionately named St Andrew's, which we will visit later. Devastating though the fire was, thankfully no loss of life was sustained, and the ruins of St Peter's stand to this day, visible from many vantage points around the village, beautiful in their own right, and as a legacy to the rich history in which the building is steeped. Our walk now leaves the church grounds and continues along Ford Lane towards the creek. There are, however, 2 very important historical sites located at the end of the private road you pass en route. The first is Alresford Hall itself, and the second the quarters. However, this road is not accessible to the general public, so strictly it cannot be visited as part of an actual footpath walk. Unfortunately, we were denied access to Alresford Hall, the building which is undoubtedly the largest in the entire village. It is also probably the most important in the history of Alresford, being home to the various lords of the manor. Over the last few years, the hall has received extensive renovation and will always take its place at the very centre of Alresford's heritage. The quarters are located in the grounds of Alresford Hall Estate, but are owned and managed totally independently. The house is said to date back as far as the English Civil War in 1648, when parliamentary troops were thought to have been quartered here, hence the name. However, on looking at ancient maps of around that time, there is no record of the building, and therefore it is possible that it was built at a later date to house the employees and servants of Alresford Hall, probably in the mid-1700s. The main feature of the beautiful construction is the Chinese pagoda, which was originally built over the lake. In 1816, General Rebo, owner of Wivenhoe Park and the Alresford Hall Estate, commissioned a certain artist by the name of John Constable to paint two pictures for him, one of Wivenhoe Park itself and the other of the Chinese-styled fishing lodge. It was painted in oil on a canvas 13 by 20 inches. In the mid-19th century, both paintings were bought by a Glaswegian schoolmaster by the name of Benjamin Brookman, who then emigrated to Australia, taking both with him, only to return a number of years later via his son. They stayed in the family and were deposited at Victoria House in London during the war for safekeeping. Eventually, however, they returned to Australia, where they remain today, hanging in the Melbourne State Gallery. The history of Alresford can be traced back over 1,000 years. By the year of 982, it was considered to be a manor of some importance, and it is mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086 as being both rich and well-stocked. The first family recorded as being present in Alresford was the de Stauntons, who to this day live on in the name of a small cul-de-sac located on Wivenhoe Road. After the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the records of the parish become more obscure. Alresford was then listed as being in the parish of London, and from that time on continued to be prominently a farming community. Although today the advent of the motor car and the railway line has allowed people to leave the village to pursue work, Alresford somehow still retains the feel of a farming community, and no one should forget how important its agricultural history has been in the development of the village. The final walk, which will take us around the remaining points of interest within Alresford, is by far the shortest and is the one which largely concentrates upon places situated within the village centre. It begins at St Andrew's Church, which replaced St Peter's after the fire of 1971. There were two locations on offer, in Church Road and in what is now St Andrew's Close. The latter of the two was chosen due to its more centralised location. This did cause a slight problem due to the fact that the proposed site was Alresford's playing field, and the church was planned to be built directly on top of the football pitch. However, the problem was soon solved when Mr Wyatt of Alresford Hall gave 3 times the original land, allowing the church to be positioned where it is today. In the 5 years previous to the building of St Andrew's, worship continued either in the village hall or in the primary school. It was at this time that Alresford's population was expanding, and hence church attendance rose. Building work began on St Andrews in 1975, and on its completion a year later the church was dedicated. The overall design was left to the architect, who planned it in the style of an Essex barn, and to this day is more modern than many traditional style churches. The overall cost was between £50,000 and £60,000, comparatively more than the £30,000 which was first anticipated. In the present day, St Andrews has over 100 people on its electoral roll, with an approximate weekly congregation of around 80. The church has known 2 rectors beside Andrew Halliday Smith, one of which is the present incumbent, George Cobb. Many groups and activities run within the church, such as Mothers' Union, handicrafts, house groups and Sunday school. Despite the tragedy of the fire at St Peter's, this wonderful new building has arisen from its ashes, and together with it, church life in Alresford has been revived. A village church will always play an important role in the overall life of its community, and St Andrews Alresford is no exception. Alresford's playing fields are situated directly adjacent and are home to the majority of sporting events that take place in the village. In the early 1990s, the tennis courts were erected and they remain a popular attraction, particularly during the summertime. The playing field, however, has primarily been host to the sport of football. Alresford has been represented by teams of all ages, from as young as under-9s right up to the Cone Rangers senior squad. In the early part of the 20th century, anyone wishing to play football did so on the various fields and meadows within the village, on which were eventually built the main housing estates where Alresford's residents now live. In 1932, Alresford's Young Men's Club formed a football team and joined the Brightlingsea and District League. The name of the team was, as it is today, the Alresford Cone Rangers. The annual subscription for joining the club was £0.50, or 12.5 new pence. Unfortunately, war interrupted the activities of the club, but it was reformed by Mr. Wilf Page and Mr. Charlie Farthing after the campaign. They played their first matches on the current pitch in 1955, joining the Colchester and East Essex League. However, changing rooms were not initially available, being first a hut which was literally hand-carried from John Watson's garden in Wivenhoe Road. Over the years, the Cone Rangers have enjoyed varied levels of success, and as new men have joined the team, football in Alresford has continued to thrive. Today, they play in the Kent Blacksall Border League, and the facilities available now are certainly a far cry from those early but very special days. The playing field continues to provide a place for people of all ages to enjoy various leisure activities, and since the recent renovation of the children's play area, this will surely be the case for many years to come. On Ford Lane itself, heading down towards the large chestnut tree at Jones's Corner, is the village hall. It was built in the 1930s due to the fact that the people of the village were denied access to the cabin at the old rectory upon arrival of a new rector to the parish. Obviously, however, a central meeting place was required, and the residents of Alresford raised enough money to finance the building of a new, modern village hall. Within most communities, the village hall is the main meeting point for the majority of the clubs and associations which are run, and in Alresford this is no exception. The Heritage Club of Alresford was started in 1994 by a group of people from within the village who have a common interest in conserving Alresford's heritage. The club meet at the home of one of the members, sharing and exchanging old photographs and newspaper cuttings, as well as discussing new revelations and discoveries about the past life of the village. In addition to this, the club organise community events, where a speaker is invited to talk on a subject of a historical nature. These nights have proved very successful, often selling out the village hall. The Heritage Club also help local charities with money which is raised through various projects, such as the Calendar of Scenic Alresford, and indeed the programme you are now watching. The Wednesday Club was started in 1993 by Ray Milburn. The idea behind the club was for people who are at home to have a regular meeting place where they can enjoy a cup of tea and a chat. The club, which nowadays mainly consists of senior citizens, meet once a week, and members enjoy playing board games, cards, or simply the friendly atmosphere. The idea for a bowls club came about in 1991, and on the night of the initial meeting, 18 members signed up immediately, and hence the club was formed. Being one of the fastest growing sports in the country, the club has a strong membership of 70 people, with 40 regular players. They meet on Monday afternoons and evenings, where they play friendlies, and on Fridays, where they compete in a league against other villages. The Bowls Club also hold many fun games, raising money for both local and national charities. The Cub Scout movement in Alresford was started in the 1970s, aiming to provide the children with a place alongside school to develop their social and individual skills. For the girls, rainbows, brownies and guides are available, dependent on age, whilst for boys there are the Beavers, who then progress to Cubs. All meet once a week, and the beavers age from between 6 to 8 years, engaging mostly in games, arts and crafts. The cubs, however, age between 8 to 10.5 years old, and in addition to those activities practiced by the beavers, they have theme nights and work towards badges. Recently, the cubs have planted a tree in Cockaines Wood as part of a conservation project. The Women's Guild is a national organisation started in 1883 by women who were connected to the cooperative movement. The Guild was formed for women to socialise and support one another at a time when the workplace was a male-dominated area and women were looking after homes and caring for children. In the 1960s, a co-op educational officer canvassed in Alresford about the Guild and hence the club started, initially having just 12 members. In the present day, 47 members meet once a week, and the club have social, cultural and educational outings, together with various organised charity events. An alternative to this is the Women's Institute, and whilst both are totally independent of one another, their activities are quite similar. They also meet regularly in the village hall. The Camera Club in Alresford was started in 1986 by 3 local photographers, Brian Light, John Hedges and Alec Corden. In the first meeting, 12 people attended, the second 26, and from then on the club never looked back. Now it has some 50 members, some of whom travel from the surrounding villages. The club has its own aims and objectives, which ultimately are to improve the standard of photography of its members. Since its inception, a committee has been elected, which produce a regular newsletter informing members of upcoming events and trips. The Camera Club regularly entertain guest speakers, who are often invited to talk on various aspects of photography. The club also hold evaluation evenings, together with various competition nights, which prove popular with the membership. Although we have featured just a few, the village has a number of other clubs and societies, attended by members of all ages, and despite the fact that more and more entertainment can readily be found without leaving one's home, the community spirit within Alresford continues to thrive. Leaving the village hall and continuing the walk, you next encounter the large chestnut tree on the junction of Wivenhoe Road and Ford Lane. This magnificent tree was planted in central Alresford to celebrate Queen Victoria's Jubilee and is a prominent feature when passing through Wivenhoe Road. There has been some form of retail establishment on the junction of these crossroads since 1858, it originally being the site of the local post office. The shop first belonged to the Mead family, and this was commonly known by all the locals as Mead's Corner. In June 1965, however, the Jones family took up residence here and continued the running of the business, and the spot then affectionately became Jones's Corner. The family continued to reside in the adjoining house, but the business closed down in 1995, mainly due to Mr. and Mrs. Jones's impending retirement. Cross over into Coach Road at this point and continue walking until you reach the junction with the B1027. Here you will directly face Alresford Business Centre, a number of industrial units that add further commercial activity to the village. As you look to your right, you can see the railway bridge which was built at the beginning of the 1930s. Before it was constructed, all traffic heading for Thorrington was required to pass through Coach Road, over the level crossing and back via Wivenhoe Road. You will also see the entrance to another one of Alresford's former farms, Tenpenny, or if using its former title, High Elms. The name was changed by its owners, who felt that its proximity to nearby Tenpenny Hill warranted the adjustment. At the beginning of the 20th century, the farm was owned and managed by a member of one of Alresford's foremost farming families, Ralph Pilkington. Records can be traced back 250 years as to the ownership of the farm, which is situated in 94 acres of beautiful farm and woodland. If you continue down this footpath, you will encounter a number of beautiful walks around the nearby woodland area. One walk leads you down through the centre of the field to the brook at the bottom, where you can rest for a while before returning up the path and back out to the main road. Crossing over to the footpath when turning left out of Tenpenny Farm will lead you over the railway bridge to the junction of Wivenhoe Road. Carrying on towards Thorrington will lead you out of the village, but on the way you will pass on your left-hand side the entrance to Brook Farm, so named because of the small stream located nearby. As before, this is now a privately owned property that was once a working establishment. The present building can be dated back to 1830. However, there are earlier signs which place a house on this site as long ago as the 14th century. During the Second World War, Brook Farm housed a number of British soldiers from the Norfolk Regiment, together with a large amount of explosives. Billeted to a number of Alresford's farms, their main task was to blow up roads and bridges should an invasion take place. The explosives which were to be used for this purpose were stored under lock and key in a large chest on which the soldiers slept, in the outhouses and grounds of this beautifully crafted traditional farmhouse. Should you not wish to continue walking towards Brook Farm, then turn right into Wivenhoe Road, the main link Alresford has with its adjacent village. As you proceed down the road, on your left-hand side, just past the entrance to the large orchard, which is situated behind the houses, you will see North Lodge. This quaint little cottage is also known as the Gingerbread House for its obvious fairy tale-like appearance. As well as North Lodge, there was also a South Lodge and a West Lodge, both situated in Ford Lane. An East Lodge, however, cannot be traced. South Lodge was demolished by the Sand and Ballast Company, so the aggregates that lay beneath it could be excavated. Continuing along Wivenhoe Road, just past the entrance to the Crestons housing estate, there are two relevant points of interest, the first of which is Bay Tree Cottage. This country-style cottage was built in 1788 by Mr. Samuel Clark. At the time of building, Samuel inscribed his initials onto a stone, which is set into the front wall. The house is typical of the buildings erected in this area in the late 1700s, and it originally had two staircases, a bread oven, and possibly a forge. Bay Tree Cottage is also known as the Smithies, due to the fact that it was owned by the Grimwood family, who were blacksmiths for several generations. Even though this building has received extensive renovation in recent years, it fortunately retains its original character, that of a quaint country cottage. Almost exactly opposite Bay Tree Cottage is Fanman's Farm, formerly a common site for the various fetes and functions held within the village, including the 1911 coronation supper. Over the years, Fanman's Farm has had inspirational qualities for two authors. It was the home of both Pat Fluker, who wrote under the name of Emily Nash, and more recently Mary Norton, author of both Bedknobs and Broomsticks and The Borrowers, both of which have been turned into major motion pictures. Passing these two locations then leads you back to Jones's Corner, from where you can then divert back up Ford Lane to your starting point at the church, or go in whichever direction you choose. The three walks we have taken you on throughout the course of this programme have been designed to show you as many of Alresford's points of interest as time will allow. We have tried to combine many of the facets that are relevant to the village life of the late 20th century, whilst still delving into the past to explore some of the rich heritage that the village possesses. The geographical layout of Alresford allows its residents the opportunity of many fine walks, and we hope that you will take the chance to enjoy firsthand the beauty that the village has to offer. Whilst there are, throughout the United Kingdom, many small communities very similar to this one, the people of Alresford feel that their own is indeed something special. As we mentioned at the very start of this programme, home is where the heart is, and in this very special part of the world, home is Alresford. Thank you for watching.